Joy's Way, a map for the Transformational Journey by Dr. Brugh Joy. Chapter 3, Energy, Experiments, Observers, Natural Teachers, and the Three Injunctions. And then there's a subtitle, Why Must Humans Be Trained into Natural States of Consciousness? Because we have chosen to believe in illusion as the basis of reality. As I've already said, all experiences have the potential of teaching us about ourselves and about life. All is energy interaction, and all matter is energy, whether that matter be the billions of atoms that interact in forming a single cell, the inconceivable number of atoms that make up our physical bodies, or the countless subatomic events that are our psyches. Nothing in the physical or psychological realm can become manifest unless energy in some form interacts with other energy, either in another or in a similar form. No event can take place unless something acts in relationship to something else. In the past, science relied on observation as a means to derive data on which hypotheses and eventually theories of physical phenomena could be based. Today, science is undergoing a reluctant but necessary shift in its approach. Now we're beginning to understand that the observer influences what is observed, just as the event observed influences the observer. Quantum mechanics and the theory of relativity predict this very concept. Old-time controlled in quotes, old-time controlled experiments never consider the possibility that observation itself might influence the experiment, and as a result, much of their data must be considered questionable today. Some Soviet experiments, which we know only from unfortunately unclear translations, seem to indicate that the eyes of the observer emit a force field that can influence what the eyes are looking at. These studies are performed by placing petri dishes containing yeast before persons with open eyes and before others with closed eyes, and noticing the differences in the growth of the two sets of culture. Open eyes increase yeast growth. Most important, it is reported that the energy from the eyes is measurable, and that some observers have a greater intensity of emission than others. Marcel Vogel, Vogel, a researcher in California, has conducted experiments on highly concentrated solutions just before the chemicals in them are ready to crystallize. While observing these solutions under a microscope, he found that he could influence the formation and the structure of such crystals by thought alone. Vogel's work may mean not only that we tend to see what we want to see through our own distorting lenses, but also that we can influence what occurs simply by seeing it in our own way. Many controlled studies cannot be reproduced by later experimenters, not just because the work is influenced by some unidentified experimental factor, such as the altitude of the research center or slight variations in temperature, but because the person organizing the experiment actually may influence the results of the study in a way unsuspected by most scientists and by that person. The psychological and physical fields that surround the researcher may be altering the results. The force field of the human being, which parapsychology terms the aura, extends from inches to many feet out from the body, depending on the individual. Persons with clairvoyant vision see that auras interact with all matter in a given space. Similarly, Kirlian photography reveals that a person does have some form of biophysical energy emission from the body which can react with another person's biophysical energy. When two people place their index fingers on the same photographic plate, the interaction of their fields can be recorded with a motion picture camera. In a similar but significantly different arrangement, the Kilner screen, Kilner screen, at Delaware Laboratory, WARR, in London, England, uses a diocene dye, DIOCENE, a dioxine dye between plates of glass to allow observers to watch what may be the auric fields of objects and people in interaction. Although personal force fields are only now coming under scrutiny of science, it should be emphasized that fields of energy have been observed for thousands of years by clairvoyants, and that average people with training can see or feel the grosser ones. Science is now beginning to confirm that auras and auric colors, as seen by clairvoyant vision, are fact. Science is also offering testing modalities to screen out people who feign these abilities. Instrumentation developed by Valerie Hunt, PhD, of UCLA, not only demonstrates the very high frequencies, sometimes emitted by certain people's bodies, but also correlates these very high frequencies with the auric colors seen by two independent tested clairvoyants, Rosalind Bruyere and Carolyn Conger. If all this energy radiation were just an interesting light show, I wouldn't bother to write about it. These energy fields, however, are involved in many interesting phenomena. In healing by laying on of hands, in seeing and or feeling abnormal energy fields emanating from the body or parts of the body if a person is ill, and in Uri Geller's ability not only to bend metallic objects, but to repair broken watches without touching them physically. The study of energy fields can also help us to determine the phenomena of the Kundalini energy, experientially explored by the Tantric yogis in the East and in the West. Above all, we must recognize that human consciousness is capable of performance beyond our wildest imagination, even though for the verification of data, science prefers instruments and distrusts the mind. There never has been, nor will there ever be, an instrument superior to the mind, which creates instruments as extensions of itself. Therefore, when I talk about the teaching experience of relating to any form in nature, I'm not talking just about looking at it. I'm talking about experiencing one's dynamic interaction with that object, about attempting to open oneself to subtler, vaster awarenesses. During the first day of a 2-day conference at the ranch, I asked all the participants to spend the next several days seeking a teacher from the natural environment. They are simply to go out and try to experience what such a teaching form might reveal to them. I ask those persons who are particularly attuned to plants to seek a teacher in the mineral kingdom, a large rock, for instance, specifically to get out of their own field of sensitivity. I suggest that each individual, rather than just observing the desert, attempt to become the desert, an unbelievably deepening experience if one is able to release ego boundaries. But there is one catch in this task of finding a teacher from nature. The participants must allow the teacher to select them. They are warned that sometimes the teacher is teaching them when they least suspect it, and that insight goes into that teaching may not come until hours or days later. The participants struggle for and almost invariably achieve a level of consciousness that can enter into a communing process with these teachers. It is the struggle, as much as the achievement, that is so helpful in enabling humans to break out of their long-time patterns of feeling separated from the natural physical world, and to realize that the human body is but one of many expressions of life force. The relationship with these teachers lasts the entire 2 weeks of the conference. Before it's over, most participants will have spent several hours each day with their teacher, meditating, contemplating, touching, tasting, smelling, working with feelings, tones, and practicing the witnessing of their psychological reactions to the task. The inspiration for this practice came from my own experience only a month after I left the world of science and medicine, and I leased a house in the small village of Findhorn, Scotland, about a mile away from the now famous Findhorn spiritual community, and in that setting I was amazed to find out how out of contact with the natural world I was. An animal was just an animal, and a tree was just a tree. I felt no relationship. But then, along the walk between my house and the Findhorn community, my consciousness was drawn to one of several magnificent pines growing in a grove. This particular tree seemed to be inviting me to embrace it. So I did. I felt a charge pass through my body and a deep emotional response of loving and caring. As I wrote to a few friends, carefully selected ones to be sure, I was having the most ridiculous love affair with a tree. Something within my physical body was capable of a relationship with a life form that seemed alien to my confused outer mind. My body knew what it was doing, even if my mind didn't. The intellectual barriers began to crack as I experienced for the first time in my adult life the feeling of being part of the physical world. Even to this day, I have to remind myself that I am a human being with a physical body beautifully similar to other life forms on the planet. All too often, I find myself living in my head, totally unaware of my form nature. Even now, I sometimes remind myself of the Jules Pfeiffer cartoon of a man talking contemptuously to his body. It is just lucky that he needs it to carry his head around, he says, otherwise he would get rid of it. In her last writings, which I came across several months ago, my mother stressed the importance of communicating with all forms in the manifest plane to achieve oneness with God. She spoke of listening to the sounds of rocks, trees, stones, whispering insects, and all forms of creation. My intellectual pursuits are have completely closed me off from the memory of her discussing this aspect of life. Teachers in nature. I selected Sky High Ranch in Lucerne Valley, California, to explore my relationship to the desert. It's an environment with which most people have little experience, but every person eventually has to confront the desert of his or her own consciousness. The physical desert is a good place to begin. To the uninitiated, the desert appears to be an enormous amount of decomposing granite, huge rock piles, endless acres of sagebrush, and large expanses of brown and light oranges. Gradually, though, the subtlety and the beauty of the desert space begin to emerge. The subtle colors, ever more clearly differentiated and more varied. The rhythms of the desert, slow and undulating, like a vast silent sea. The plant and animal life, exclusive in their habits. Some so small that one has to get down on hands and knees to appreciate them. The silence, a disturbing element to the city dweller. And of course the vastness. God, the vastness of the desert. And its even vaster nighttime sky, demanding that one come out of the prison cell of one's consciousness. The 560-acre ranch is located about 4,000 feet above sea level between the high Mojave Desert and the San Bernardino Mountains, in what biological scientists call a transition zone. The biological transition zone is important to my work because my work is in the transition zone of consciousness. All of us, at all times, are in relationship to all that surrounds us, and we are influenced by it. For beginning work in higher consciousness, a space that is unpolluted psychically and physically cannot be just imagined. It must be experienced. To remove oneself from the city, only for such a brief time as 2 weeks, provides at least some opportunity to be free of inundation by literally hundreds of thousands of entrepreneurs vying for one's attention from all other psychic litter of man and machine. In the 18 months before I began writing this book, more than 500 people were introduced to the fundamentals of higher consciousness at Sky High Ranch. In groups of 16 to 26 people, usually for 2 weeks, they were separated from their daily environments, isolated on the ranch, with no access to newspapers, television, radio, or telephones. This isolation from the outer world was a significant factor in the changes that took place in all the participants, and each of them achieved heightened states of consciousness, even if only briefly. When I say that each person must, at one time or another, explore the desert of consciousness, I am talking about the same kind of fundamentally important experience that appears as trips into the desert in the Bible and in many other manuscripts. It is not simply the literal physical desert that must be confronted, but the essence that the desert represents. The mainspring of this adventure is the shift from the constructed aspects of reality to a perspective of limitless potential. One has to stretch the senses, reaching deeply for hidden resources. Without the lush, mothering nourishment of fertile forests, or the moodiness and magnificence of rapidly changing seashore, the desert appears barren, but instead of being barren, the desert is really subtle, and subtlety is the essence of my teaching there. Consciousness loves contrast. It is through the contrast of experiences that we are most likely to see most clearly. I said previously that one of the ways to approaching the heightening aspects of the beginner's mind is to hold memory in check and to learn to appreciate repetitions of experience as if each repetition were the initial encounter. Allowing contrasting experiences or entering into them is a simple technique to heighten awareness. The greater the contrast, the more likely is awareness to pay attention. What greater contrast to usual life pattern of a Westerner than to enter the desert in solitude? I am reminded of a statement by the Vice-Chancellor of a university in England that I heard at a scientific conference in April 1975. This man, with impeccable credentials and a wealth of knowledge, was lamenting that what he felt to be an error in the educational system. More than 90% of what I teach, he commented, is of an informational nature. Less than 10% is derived from direct life experience. I was shocked. So much of my education was information, and so very little was direct experience. This thought impelled me to learn about myself, not just through information and ideas about me, but through direct experience of myself. Gradually, and later with greater acceleration, I began to leave the citadel of my intellect for longer and longer periods of time, with less and less anxiety. This process is painful because it requires the ability to be devastatingly honest with oneself. I say that one must be able to draw the honesty cards, to accept what is before one's awareness, without rationalization or defense, in order to see clearly what is. To do so, one must remember 3 injunctions. Make no comparisons, make no judgments, and delete your need to understand. The story of the injunctions demonstrates both their possible usefulness and the possible consequences of not following them. In November 1975, a woman who lived near Redlands, California, came to the ranch for a personal consultation with me. In going into the reasons for her visit, she said that she had for some time been reading tarot cards psychically. She'd been reading tarot cards psychically. She was so gifted in accuracy. bringing through the future aspects of any question a client asks, that she soon found herself inundated by phone calls from all over the world. Her talent in this particular psi arena had become available to her 18 months before her visit to me. Now she very much wanted to be free of her psychic gift. She was emotionally unprepared to handle seeing negative events occurring in the future. Even when she was not reading the tarot cards, she often became aware of traumatic events that were about to take place from minutes to hours after she perceived them. She had been so shaken by these experiences that a few months before coming to the ranch, she had stopped doing readings and had embarked on a course of study in conventional psychology at a nearby university. Respectable credentials and conventional work were more important to her than a strange ability that is, that is to her outer mind, upsetting and abnormal. After we were well into her session, she suddenly remembered an event that had taken place 3 years before. She had mentioned it to no one else because she considered it an insane experience. A voice had spoken to her. She remembered the words perfectly, but even after 3 years, at the time of our conversation, they held no meaning for her. This event happened some 18 months before the onset of her psi ability. It occurred dramatically, and she had no preparation for it. She emphasized to me that until then she was a perfectly normal human being without any knowledge of paranormal experiences or even of meditation. She was just a housewife. That the event took place in this context is important. To another person, it might have been the fulfillment of long years of spiritual preparation, but that woman, at that time, had no idea that such spiritual development was desirable or even possible. The episode occurred one day at sunset while she was walking along the beach in Santa Monica, California. Glancing down, she noticed that as each foot sank into the sand, an iridescent light would appear, coming from the sand. Within a few minutes, her feet also took on the eerie iridescence. She tried in vain to make the light go away, and at the same time, she was deeply fascinated by it. As its many colors intensified, she lifted her gaze to watch the waves breaking on the shoreline, and she saw the strange light emanated from the waves too, as they crested and broke. Suddenly, everything radiated this light in a fantastic display of color. The woman lost all sense of time and normal spatial relationships. And she realized a feeling of overwhelming well-being, as if she were in a state of bliss, where she was one with everything, and all was God. As the experience came to its climax, she heard a booming voice. It was unlike anything she'd ever heard. She was frightened by it. She was afraid that she was going insane. The voice slowly and repetitively said to her, "There are 3 injunctions for you. Pay attention to them. Make no comparisons. Make no comparisons. Make no judgments. Make no judgments. Delete your need to understand. Delete your need to understand." The experience then faded gradually as she returned to ordinary consciousness. She was filled with wonder and with fear. Instead of realizing that she had touched cosmic awareness, she believed that she had experienced insanity. All of you who are working so diligently on achieving cosmic consciousness through long and sometimes painful disciplined practice, take note. The event was spontaneous, totally unexpected, fully developed, and occurred in a woman to whom, at least in this lifetime, Its significance and nature were completely veiled. It came before the development of her ability to transcend the barriers of time and space. I stress these points because I strongly suspect that experiences of this nature occur in ordinary people much more frequently than they are reported, and that what keeps people silent is the fear of being thought abnormal or psychotic. Make no comparisons. Time and again, we are conditioned to evaluate ourselves in relationship to other people through competitive examinations, sports, promotions, social standing, and so on. Each society has its own selection of criteria to which its people must measure up, by which they are compared. In our particular psychological and physical makeup, if our particular psychological and physical makeup does not meet the standard, we experience trauma. Yet we ourselves are the ones who create this trauma, because it is not the rejection or non-acceptance by other people, but non-acceptance or rejection by ourselves that causes the pain. The tendency to live in ideas about reality isolates the mind from true reality of the physical level. The idea level has an impossible time when it is directly confronted by the manifest level. Self is. The self is true, without question. But ideas about the self may be true or false. And in this ambiguity lies the problem. If the individual insists on holding on to ideas rather than harmonizing what is, pain must follow. The individual then is driven to take stronger defensive measures, and repression, depression, and abreaction compound the difficulty. The ability to experience and to flow with what is signals the beginning of the unification of mind, body, and spirit. It is the first initiation into a natural state of beingness. Are we too fat, too short, too tall, too uneducated, too intellectual, too emotional, too feminine, too masculine, too strange, too undisciplined, too weak, too immature, too compulsive, too unspiritual, too ungifted? Do we criticize ourselves because we smoke or don't smoke? Because we drink or don't drink? Because we are religious or not religious? The list of possibilities is endless. Rooted in the injunction, make no comparisons, is the corollary idea, be whatever you are. Experience of the self, not any preconceived ideas about the various aspects of the self, is what should dictate whether something should be changed. In conference work at the ranch, this injunction comes up repeatedly. As the first participants begin to experience expanded states of consciousness, the others, observing them, start the self-whipping process. They report that they feel left out, inadequate, insecure, and relatively worthless. When I point out to them that they could be resonating with the experience the expanded member is enjoying, opening to the experience, and rejoicing in another's accomplishment, they begin to understand how their own minds obstruct expanded awareness, how they and their comparisons are holding back their own growth. Actually, the heightened individual helps to heighten others through the principle of induction. That is, the heightened person's level of consciousness is reflected in his or her body energy field, so that a similar response is induced in the second person's energy field, and that response moves on to the second person's awareness. Induction works better if the second person's induction field isn't blocked by defenses. Unfortunately, the process of comparison is not the only cause of defenses. It often happens that, even though the aspirant's outer mind envisions the heightening experience as desirable, the individual feels threatened on some inner level by the fear of loss of control. To defend against that imagined loss, a reactive block is established. Again, I offer experience from my own life as an example. Through most of my life, I saw my body as less masculine in form than the ideal I held, and the standard I was convinced others held. My right testicle was undescended until I was 14. I didn't need to shave until I was 19, and my beard growth is patchy. Mild breast enlargement was noted in adolescence. My skin was too smooth, and my relative lack of body hair, especially on the chest, was unacceptable to me. I believed that there was something wrong with me. It was not until I reached my early 30s that I realized the fallaciousness of this self-made trauma. I now have no need to compare myself to any other human form, certainly not to an image of a different self, one that doesn't even exist. When my self-rejection began to crumble, the energy that had gone into my psychological defenses was released into a deep sense of appreciation and wonderment at the infinite variations that form nature displays. At the infinite variations that form nature displays. The comparison process literally locks us into a prison filled with psychological pain until I could reach a state of awareness that each individual is a distinct and unique representation of form and psyche. I was trapped. Then awareness let me out of the prison and led me to the astonishing truth. We are far more than we possibly could wish, but we are herded into a narrow spectrum of beliefs about who and what we are. To begin to awaken into the potential experience of your own individual wholeness demands that no comparisons be made. There is only one entity in the entire plane who can make the comparison that generates the vicious cycle, and that entity is you. My greatest test of self-value came during the night of the full moon in February 1975, when I spent 13 hours alone in the Great Pyramid of Cheops. One of many profound experiences that night was the presentation of every flaw of my beingness. Each one rapidly flashed before my awareness, like a series of photographic slides in super vivid color and detail. Seeing them, I knew I could choose between reacting and observing, and I chose the latter. The total of my beingness then flashed before me, and with insight into each flaw, I no longer saw them as flaws, but rather as challenges, necessary experiences for my unfolding and awakening. There is another quotation from Goethe. If you treat a man as he appears to be, you make him worse than he is. But if you treat a man as if he already were what he potentially could be, you make him what he should be. The key word is appears. Rarely, if ever, do we see the totality, including the potential not yet manifest, of ourselves or another human being. The filtering system of our outer mind is too strong. In conferences at the ranch, after I delivered the Goethe quotation to participants, I asked that each spend an entire afternoon paraphrasing this quotation into a contemplation of, if I treat myself as I think I appear to be, I make myself less than I am. But if I treat myself as if I already were what I potentially could be, I make myself what I should be. Only linear, time-trapped thoughts prevent us from seeing the staggering beauty of our own entirety. Ideas about what is right and what is wrong, in the vast majority of cases, not intrinsically valid. They can be valid only relative to the perspective of the consciousness that holds them, and as we have seen, they can be mistaken even then. There are many value systems, as one can easily discern in traveling throughout the world, and each has its own ideas of right and wrong. The awakening process brings one to the deeper wisdoms, wherein one finds a preference for that which feels harmonious, natural, uplifting, expanding, and inspiring. Instead of striving for ideas of what ought to be, one chooses what fits into what is. It is especially important that one not interpret the injunction against making comparisons as an extortion to live in a state of complacency, where everything that the outer mind sees is rationalized as being perfect or right, without the need for change. Complacency is the way of the ignorant. The critical key here is to unhook the emotional or psychological defense mechanisms so that one may begin to see and accept what is coming from the more expanded states of awareness. What appears undesirable from a less inspired state may be in perfect harmony from a higher point of view. We are all in different stages of development in awareness. The ever-expanding realizations that eventually bring one into illumination of mastery of one's current level of existence are a natural process in the experience of life. Each of us chooses whether to honor that deeper yearning for spiritual fulfillment when it begins to emerge into awareness. The most common choice is to ignore it, to sink back into comfortable, established life patterns already conveniently rationalized as real and important. If one is fundamentally content with one's life, if there is no strong suspicion that there is more to beingness than what the usual human being calls life, if one does not feel a pull towards another level of awareness, then there is no need to be reading a book discussing the transformational process. As I warned in the introduction, the moment one begins to seek the path for change and expansion of awareness, one's life changes, often dramatically. Once the nectar is tasted, there is no turning back. Like the outgrown clothing of youth, the old patterns and beliefs no longer fit. A sense of constriction and pain will be experienced if one tries to continue embracing one's old gods. And then he goes on to explain, make no judgments. All judgments of the kind meant in the second injunction issue out of conditioned value systems, which in turn have roots in emotional reflex arc. In the emotional reflex arc, a judgment of this kind can only be a reaction to what has been experienced. Note the word reaction, because it is the criterion to determine whether the response is a conditioned one and not an intrinsic value. Our reactions to good or bad, beautiful or ugly, talented or untalented, are trained responses related to the culture and subculture of our upbringing and education. Before one commits oneself to any judgment, one must at least attempt to see whence the reaction came. If it is an idea also held by mother, father, teacher, an authority figure in a religious institution, you might ask yourself, is it valid? You might ask yourself whether it is valid, whether it's a valid natural response in its own right, or whether it's been conditioned into you by those authorities. Do you have the alternative to the perspective from which you are viewing and experiencing the situation? The task is to discern an event, to see it clearly, at first, without response. Then, one's later response is a clue to one's development or awakening. Human consciousness becomes rigid through training. Once it has been conditioned, it cannot appreciate natural states of experience without being retrained. In Rudolf Steiner's book, Theosophy, the last chapter, entitled The Path of Knowledge, contains some profound words on the consequences of judgment, and he quotes them here. One of the first qualities that everyone wishing to acquire a vision of higher facts has to develop is the unreserved, unprejudiced laying of oneself open to what is revealed by human life or by the world external to man. Knowledge is received only in these moments, in which every judgment, every criticism coming from ourselves is silent. Anyone who wishes to tread the path of higher knowledge must train himself to be able, at any given time, to obliterate himself with all his prejudices. As long as he obliterates himself, the revelations of the new world flow to him. This open-minded and uncritical laying of ourselves open has nothing to do with blind faith. The important thing is not that we should believe blindly in anything, but that we should not put a blind judgment in place of the living impression. And that's the end of that quote by Steiner. And then he goes on to talk about delete your need to understand. Notice that this third and final injunction does not ask one to delete understanding. It clearly warns against hanging on to the need to understand, which stems from preconditioned areas of the psyche. Direct knowledge or understanding simply is, and has nothing to do with the need on the part of the observer. The need to understand comes between the observer and what is being presented to the awareness. It hinders, it gets in the way. The need to understand indicates a need to control, to live by the idea, rather than the flowing of the reality of higher consciousness. Let go of the need to understand, just as you let go of comparisons and judgments, so that you can experience without encumbrances what reality is. As for the woman who heard the voice on the beach, what she related was obviously an experience in conscious awareness. If she had understood and followed the 3 injunctions that she received, she might never have had to experience pain from what came into her life by way of her breakthrough into higher dimensions of consciousness. All 3 injunctions have to do with giving up ideas of what ought to be and accepting what is. And it is from hanging on to what ought to be and rejecting what is that pain comes from. And let me add, even as great a psychic gift as hers is only one of many initial experiences in spiritual psychological development. Let me read that last sentence again. And let me add, even as great a psychic gift as hers is, only one of one, no. And let me add, even as great a psychic gift as hers is only one of many initial experiences in spiritual psychological development. So, and that concludes Chapter 3. Chapter 4 is going to be called Dream Analysis, Telepathy, the Tarot, and the I Ching. So I hope you enjoyed that. And like and subscribe. And till soon.